This week on Q&A, National Public Radio's Morning Edition co-host Steve Inskeep discusses his revolutionary road trip series, as well as his latest book titled Instant City, Life and Death in Karachi.
Steve Inskeep, when did you first go to work for NPR?
I got hired full-time for them in 1996. I'd been freelancing for a while, and they hired me to cover politics. Actually, they hired me to cover anything that needed done that nobody else was available to do. And on one of my first days there, my first full day there actually, they said, "Can you get on a plane tonight and go cover the New Hampshire primary?" So I've just been doing it ever since, and been sent to cover plane crashes, been sent to cover wars, covered Congress, presidential campaigns, disasters of various kinds, and have really enjoyed myself.
Why radio?
I got started in radio in high school. When I was in Carmel, Indiana, there was a high school radio station, and my brother got on staff. You had to try out, and I figured if my older brother could do it, I could do it. I tried out and got on staff, and one of the first things that I did was call football games and basketball games. I was a play-by-play guy. And later in college, I got paid, I don't know, $10 a game to be the color man for high school and football games, high school football and basketball games in Kentucky. I also discovered public radio at the same time, and I was always more of a news guy. I majored in history in college, and I stayed with it. I fell in love with NPR in particular. I had in Kentucky, at this little station at Morehead State University in Kentucky, WMKY, I had a Saturday morning shift. So I had to get up in the middle of the night and go in and basically just turn the radio on. It had been off overnight, and put on national programs, put them on the air. And so I got to sit there and listen to Scott Simon, Weekend Edition, for 2 hours. And then they repeated the program, and I listened again. And he's a brilliant broadcaster on Saturday mornings on NPR. And I just really got to hear twice how he'd conduct an interview, how he'd write, how he'd put a picture in people's heads. And it was brilliant. And I just kind of fell in love with it that way.
It's interesting. I think I read this in your book, or one of the articles that you've written, your book on Karachi, that it mattered to you at some point when somebody recognized your voice.
Yeah.
Was it a young girl?
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. I was on an airplane on my way to Karachi to do some of the research for this book. And we were in Qatar, and so we're boarding the plane. I just changed planes in Doha, Qatar. And someone taps my shoulder, and I turn around, and there's a teenager there, and she says, "Are you that guy from NPR?" And I was that guy from NPR. And she introduced me to her mother, who was the one who really wanted to talk to me, who had sent her daughter over to get me. I ended up sitting part of the time next to them on the flight because she had a lot to tell me. She was a woman of Pakistani origin, currently lives in Texas, and she had grown up in the city of Karachi. And I had done a couple of years before at this point a series of radio stories from Karachi, and she remembered them, and she'd listened to every one. And she listened because she was an NPR fan, but also because she was a Karachiite. She was from that town. And you can imagine, Brian, if somebody starts mouthing off about your hometown, you would have a lot of opinions about what they had to say. And she was listening intensely closely. She was still from there, in a way. And she said, "You know, you did fine. You got the news, but there was so much more to say. You needed to get more." And I was happy to hear her say that, actually, because that's why I was going back. I had reported from Karachi several times over the years, and I just got more and more interested and wanted to learn more. There's so much happening in a city of millions of people.
The paperback edition of your book, Instant City, is out. What was the origin of this book? When did you first start working on it, and why Karachi?
I think that it grew out of the radio series that I mentioned in 2008. I had first been to Karachi in 2002. It was a way station on my way to cover the war in Afghanistan. Then I was assigned to spend time there. The first story that I covered there was court proceedings relating to the death of the Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl. So it immediately seemed to me like a scary place. It's huge. Just crossing the street can get you killed. And I'm covering this terrible, terrible story of the death of Daniel Pearl. It was a very negative introduction to the city. But I returned. I heard some of the stories of the people who lived there. I became fascinated in how the city looked. It's an amazing looking city. There will be these pieces of British architecture from the Victorian era and a giant old city hall from 1931, give or take a couple of years. And there will be massive neighborhoods of concrete block homes where millions of people live. And I was just drawn into the story of this place. I have been covering cities of different kinds all my career as a journalist. I went to Morehead State University in Kentucky, which is basically in the countryside, but also spent a year at Hunter College in New York, and was assigned to read a book called The Power Broker by Robert Caro, about Robert Moses, this great builder of New York City. And I became so fascinated with the city that surrounded me and the way that it had grown and changed over the years, and the different kinds of people who came and went, and the way that people held political power had affected their lives for better and often for worse. And that has informed almost every kind of reporting I've done ever since. So many different kinds of stories I've done over the years are basically stories about cities in different parts of the world. Even some of my war reporting in Afghanistan was in one way or another about a city like Kandahar and how it was changing under extraordinary pressure. And so I wanted to pick a city somewhere in the world that exemplified the way that a city grows and changes, the way that our urban world is growing and changing. So many cities around the world are exploding in size. Most of the world's population lives in cities now. I wanted to pick one city that I could look at as its own world. I mean, any given city like this is so large and so absorbing and so interesting that it's almost like a little snow globe, where it's a self-contained world, where people have these intense experiences and stories that involve each other, that are about each other, that I wanted to learn. And you just say hello to someone in a place like Karachi, and an amazing, often heart-wrenching story comes out of them. And so I wanted to pick one example of the way that our urban world was changing, and this, to me, sounded like a great example, and the more I learned about it, the more I felt that I picked a good one.
A couple of details. You live where?
Right now, in Washington, D.C.
Your full-time job?
I am the co-host of Morning Edition on NPR.
Time do you get up?
I get up about 2:45 in the morning and get into work about 3:45, and the show goes on the air at 5 o'clock Eastern Time.
How long are you there?
Totally depends on the day. In theory, I might get out around noon. Some days it might be 2 p.m. Some days someone will say, well, the chief of staff can do the interview with you, but it's at 5:30 p.m. And so it's just going to be a long day. Sometimes there's a presidential debate and you need to be there during or right after the debate, and so you just work crazy hours and sleep on a couch. The compensation, though, Brian, is that sometimes I can slip away at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. And go see my family or help my wife with something or have time to write a book. And so it varies from day to day, and it's a constant process of improvisation of time management. Although when you work a job like this, where I'm not covering a beat, you're kind of paying attention to the whole world, really your entire life becomes your work. I mean, you might be reading an article, you might hear something in conversation, you might watch a movie, anything might happen to you and you discover it's a story or will inform an interview that you're doing.
There's an obvious reason to ask this question. What time does your co-host get up?
Oh, okay, well there you go. Renee Montaigne, who's in Los Angeles, 3 hours to the west, is doing the same thing I'm doing, only 3 hours sooner.
Why is she there and you're here?
Why is she there? Why is she there? No, that was a decision by NPR that I thought was really meaningful. We cover a lot of Washington news. It's important to us to get that story right. And we're headquartered in Washington, D.C. But we wanted to get a broader sense of the country. We have stations in every state. We have stations in every corner of every state. We have millions of listeners across the country. We feel that we have done a better job than a lot of news organizations of covering stories in Indiana, my home state, or Kentucky, where I used to live, or Nebraska, but we wanted to do more. And by shifting half of the program, in effect, one of the hosts, some of the staff, to Los Angeles, to the other coast. Yeah, we're not in the middle of the country, we're not in Kansas, but it's a different perspective than Washington, D.C. And it's great, we have these bicoastal meetings each morning where I'm sitting at a table, some of my colleagues are sitting at a table, and our colleagues in California, in Culver City, California to be precise, are on a screen at their own table 3,000 miles away, are talking, and they just have a completely different perspective on things. Things that seem obsessively important to us in Washington seem irrelevant there. And the reverse can also be true. And it's great to have the conversation going back and forth. It adds to the fact that we have bureaus across the country with correspondents based in places like Chicago or living in New Orleans. We had full-time people in New Orleans for a couple of years after Katrina. And having people in different places just really enriches the conversation and the range of stories we do.
I want to run one of your radio reports. I don't ask you where it was or anything, just so people can hear you. This is on the road. We'll find out afterwards. It's about a minute and a half, I think.
Okay.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Renee Montagne.
And I'm Steve Inskeep, standing on the ruins of ancient Carthage. We're by the Mediterranean Sea, which is almost sky blue today. This city was a city in what is now Tunisia. It was the capital of an empire, destroyed by the Romans more than 2,000 years ago, then rebuilt before it fell into ruin again. Today, what we see are a couple of stone columns rising against the sky, and below them just the foundations of ancient buildings. We've come here to begin a journey along this historic coastline, through Tunisia, through Libya, through Egypt. We're watching as nations rebuild themselves after the revolutions known as the Arab Spring. We're talking with many people, including a man who works in a palace next door to the ruins. He's the new president of Tunisia, Monsef Marzouki. Is it fair to say that you faced the job of rebuilding a government or building a government almost from the foundations?
Yes, of course, because, when you have a dictatorship, the dictatorship destroys the social systems, like the judiciary, like the press, like even the health system. So now we have to rebuild completely, and this would take a long time.
That's Tunisia's new president, who works in the same palace where a dictator ruled this country for more than 20 years.
Where were you?
I was in Tunisia, in Tunis, beginning what turned out to be about a 2,700-mile road trip across North Africa. We went from Tunis through Libya to Cairo over the course of about 3 weeks, and in that time interviewed I don't know how many people along the way and tried to follow up on the events of the Arab Spring. This is a story that compelled the world, that was of great interest to me. I'd been in Egypt before, and I wanted to understand the next chapter of that story. All the TV cameras were there for the crowds in Tahrir Square and in different places around the Arab world, but there was a story that was at least as important going on at that moment. And I wanted not just to talk to officials, but just to get a glimpse of people's lives and meet people along the way. And so we arranged some interviews along the way. We had contacts along the way, but a great deal of that trip, by design, was in the end improvisation. Who did we meet and what did we see?
How did you travel?
By car, by a series of cars. We had a driver in each country. You could drive overseas in a conflict zone or in a troubled country, but you would not be wise to do that. It's great to have a local driver who knows where he's going, who can talk with the armed men at checkpoints, who can say hello to them and kind of smooth things out.
How many people with you?
I had one NPR producer. There was one photographer. Nishant Dahia was the producer, John Poole the photographer. We had a driver in each country and an interpreter in each country. So it's a carload. Or a van load in a couple of cases. And with that group of people, you keep going. Sometimes we drove hundreds of miles a day. Sometimes we'd spend several days in the same city. And each day we were trying to build on what we learned about how democracy was evolving, if it was going to evolve at all, how security was evolving, if there was any, and in many cases there were not, particularly Libya, but there were security problems in all three countries. And we were just looking for the heartbeat of these places.
What's the first thing you'd tell somebody if they say they want to do what you did?
I'd say go ahead. I would say go ahead.
Is it expensive?
Of course it's expensive, especially if you want to do it quickly and if you want to do it securely. I mean, you need to look for a decent hotel to spend the night, and you need to hire good people to take you along.
Security, you worry about that?
No, well, you do worry about security. I think that you don't take security. You don't take like a bunch of armed guys, and some journalists will. Some TV crews that have a lot of expensive equipment may well do that in certain situations. But the thing that you do is basically you get in the vehicle, you go where you're going, you introduce yourself to people, and by and large people take care of you. And even in a conflict zone, even in a war zone, even in a country where the United States may be very unpopular, people will meet a foreigner and they will relate to you as a human being. And there will be local cultures of hospitality that also take over and effectively protect you. And you just rely on your fellow human beings to look after you. And often, as a foreigner, I think I'm better taken care of by people in many places than if the same people I'm interacting with were dealing with locals.
What did you find the reaction was to you as an American?
It was okay. People are always eager, almost always eager to meet an American. Even when they're not happy to meet an American, they are polite. I'm remembering an occasion when I went in Kandahar, Afghanistan, to sit with a man named Haji Bashar, who had been a notorious, he'd been accused of being a notorious, he'd been accused of being an opium trafficker and accused of being the financier of the Taliban, of Mullah Omar, and there was little doubt of these things. And he didn't want to talk, he didn't want to see me, but it's Afghanistan, and I've come to his doorstep, so I'm his guest, and he has to offer me tea. And so I sat with him and a number of other people, and they spent the whole time complaining about the United States. They were not happy with anything the United States had done. This was early 2002. But even though they were very angry, they were still going to give me tea, and I was going to get my 20 minutes with them while we had the tea, and I was going to walk away and be fine. So people respond to you in that way. Most people are friendlier than that, frankly. Most people will invite you home. Most people have a lot that they want to say. It's as if, in many cases, people have been thinking about the United States a lot, probably a lot more than we think about people in other countries. And suddenly an American appears, and even though I am not an employee of the government, I am not an ambassador, it's as if I am the U.S. ambassador, and they want the United States to know something. They want the United States to know what their lives are like. They may have a specific message about a specific American policy they want to let you know. But in any case, they're very courteous and often really energizing to meet.
You said earlier you were from Carmel, Indiana,
Yeah.
and that you went to Morehead State in
Yes.
Kentucky. What's Morehead State? What drew you there?
I got a scholarship to go there. I'd heard about it through various ways, and they are a university that was founded in the coal mining country in eastern Kentucky, and the sons and daughters of coal miners have gone there for generations, and they decided that they wanted more out-of-state students. They wanted basically a more diverse student body, if you will. And so they invited people from out of state who were National Merit Scholars, it's called, to come. And I had an opportunity to come and do that. And it was very different from the suburb of Indianapolis where I'd grown up in Indiana. And I was honored to have that experience.
The reason I asked that was that they jump back to that is that here you are in Tunisia, and
Yeah.
you're in Egypt, and you're in Libya, and you've been in Afghanistan, Iraq? You've been to Iraq?
That's right.
Where did you get this interest? You said you studied history at Morehead State, but where did you get the interest in doing this kind of thing?
You know, I think I got it from books. I grew up reading a lot. My parents were both teachers. They were both public school teachers in Indiana. My mom taught English. My dad became a coach and athletic director. And
Where, by the way?
my mom in the Carmel school system in the town where I grew up, and my dad at North Central in Indianapolis. Two really big school systems, really big athletically successful school systems, and schools that the local folks are really, really proud of in a lot of different ways, and that have been academically really successful. And I grew up reading a lot, and I would read about wars, and I'd read about pirates and different parts of the world, and read about the British Empire, and read about the Old West in the United States as a kid. And yeah, because I love that, and because I guess I just grew up curious, I've wanted to see more and more. Ultimately, going overseas to cover wars was a little bit of a chance thing. I'd done a fellowship and went to Colombia in the 1990s for a little while, but I had not really covered a war until after 9/11. And they needed an extra person in Afghanistan. And so they sent me in November of 2001, which was a terrifying experience. But the experience that I had then, and that has been repeated in different ways each trip I've taken ever since, is that it is terrifying to contemplate going to a place in the midst of conflict, but then you get there and you're so busy working, and you're so absorbed with what's happening, you're so engaged in it, that it's not scary for a while. It may build up after a while. After you've spent some time in a difficult situation, it builds up and it can get very difficult. But it's so energizing to get there, to cover a story, and to feel like you're doing something really important. You feel like every single fact that you are able to get out to the world is really, really important, even more so than normal.
You mentioned the Robert Caro book on Robert Moses.
Yes.
And he went on to write all the books on Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
But is there another book, before we go to another clip, that has had a big impact on you?
Oh gosh, The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. I read that book again and again, just a detailed explanation of how the government works, how a policy was made, in that case the policy that led to the war in Vietnam. Bob Woodward's All the President's Men and The Final Days, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, of course, just amazing pieces of reporting. And if you're an aspiring reporter, to read All the President's Men is a great experience.
Now, as we listen to this next clip, it's only a minute long, it's still in Tunisia. I want to come back and ask you about the difference between radio and television. And it's because we don't show you doing this so people can see what it sounds like,
Sure.
But there's a big difference. Let's watch or listen to this.
Okay. Liquor is suddenly a flashpoint as Islamists gain more power in Tunisia. Almost everywhere we've been, we've heard stories of bars and liquor stores forced to close. News reports say 2 liquor stores were burned in Tunisia's northwest. At our hotel in still another town, the staff informed us they'd just shut down the bar after religious conservatives complained. News of all of this has spread to bars that remain open, like a dim dive in Tunis called JFK. Here, a political activist, Rami Saghayer, sipped a beer while Killing Me Softly played on the sound system.
This bar, yeah, it's my favorite place in the center of the town, you know.
He finds his friends here along with green bottles of Celtia, a Tunisian-made beer, which the bartender opens one-handed by knocking the bottles against the side of the table. Not only that, the bar is conveniently near the place where protesters, including Saghayer, brought down Tunisia's last ruler. Now he's dismayed that, in his view, Islamists are ruining his dream of a free Tunisia.
Very soon I'll get to the Islamist part of it, but
Sure.
First of all, why did he name the bar JFK?
I don't even know the answer to that, but it's a great detail. And it suggests the kind of cultural interaction that there is between places that seem on the surface very far from us and the United States.
What's the difference between writing for radio and writing for television?
I think that you need to focus in radio, and I think this is true of print also, on putting pictures in people's heads. You know, what color was the beer bottle? How dim was it in there? What did the guy look like? You want to include just enough of those details so that people feel like they're there. And it can be, in a way, if you do it well, other people will judge if I do it any good. If you do it well, it can draw people in. It can draw people in the way that a novel draws you into a different world than the one that you're inhabiting as you experience it.
In your book, and I know we're jumping around, but there's a subtext to everything that you did over on the Revolutionary Road Trip, which was when?
This was in mid-2012. This was May and June.
May and June. Your book was written, you said you started in 2008. Mm-hmm. It first came out on Karachi. When did it first come out?
In October of 2011.
The subtext on this is Islam. And I'm reading on a page 78 where you write about a guy named Maududi. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. By the way, your pronunciation of all these names is a compliment. How do you do it? I mean, you got through all these names. It looks like it's without effort.
Oh, well, I'm glad that it looks like it's without effort.
Sounds like it's
you make an effort, and sometimes you just get it wrong, and sometimes just basic words you get wrong. I mean, Arabic, or in the case of Pakistan, Urdu, are incredibly varied languages, and there's so many dialects and so many different pronunciations in them. But Maududi is the man that you're referring to.
And Jinnah, because this is the page where you talk about Islam and the difference between Jinnah and Maududi.
Yeah. Muhammad Ali Jinnah is the founder of Pakistan, the George Washington of Pakistan, if you will. He was a lawyer in the time when Pakistan was part of British India and part of the long, long fight for independence, and became the first leader, the Governor General, it was called then, of Pakistan. And he was, in ways that we would recognize, a secular politician. I don't believe he used that word, but he gave a famous speech about 3 days before Pakistan's independence, in which he said to this country that was mostly Muslim but had millions of Hindus at that time and many other kinds of people as well, that the state has business that is separate from religion. You are free to go to your temples, free to go to your mosques, he said. They are separate, and we're not going to discriminate based on color, caste, as the caste system had been in India, or creed. It was an amazingly progressive speech in 1947. It would have been an amazingly progressive speech in the United States in 1947. And so that was one vision of how to have a majority Muslim country, which is what they were creating when they created Pakistan. The other vision is represented in my book, and I believe in history, by Maududi, who was the founder of a Muslim party, an Islamist party that remains in Pakistan today and is powerful and has spawned other parties over the years. And he was, you could call him a fundamentalist, although I don't see that word used in this period either. And what I mean by that is he believed that people should follow, that Muslims should follow the clear commands of Islam, the basic commands of Islam, and not go beyond that.
Let me read what you quote him as saying, and then you say he offered a sweeping Leninist view of his cause in Lahore in 1939.
Yes, that was part of his innovation as well. This is a guy in the mid-20th century when there are all these leftist revolutionary movements around the world, and he grabbed their techniques, he grabbed their language, and I believe in the speech to which you refer, he goes on to say that this is not a religion I'm talking about, it's a global revolutionary movement.
Let me read that,
Please.
and we'll put it on the screen so people can see it, because it reflects some of what's going on in the world today. This fellow Maududi says, he's no longer alive, I assume.
No.
Islam is not the name of a religion, nor is Muslim the title of a nation. In reality, Islam is a revolutionary ideology and program which seeks to alter the social order of the whole world and rebuild it in conformity with its own tenets and ideals. Muslim is the title of that international revolutionary party organized by Islam to carry into effect its revolutionary program. And jihad refers to that revolutionary struggle and utmost exertion which the Islamic Party brings into play to achieve this objective. How much of that is the way they're thinking in that whole world that you travel in?
Well, the rhetoric has changed, but among extremists, a lot of the ideas are still fundamentally there. And you still have that conflict between someone like Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who's thinking of founding a nation state, thinking of Muslims in India basically as an ethnic group. When he says we're a separate nation, that's basically what he's charging. And thinking of creating a state that Muslims will have political power over, but the state is not supposed to tell them what to do. And by necessity, because it was an extremely diverse place, he was hoping that the state would also make room for Hindus, Parsis, various other groups that were very important to Pakistan at the beginning and have remained important to Pakistan ever since. He was thinking in terms of statehood. Maududi was thinking in terms of global revolution. Now, to what extent did he mean that? We could argue that. I mean, Maududi's party ended up contesting elections, and they have continued to contest elections in Pakistan ever since. They have made themselves part of the democratic process. They have not been violent extremists, at least the core of the group, the leadership of the group, has not been linked with violent extremism the way that other people have been. But they're thinking across national boundaries. They have rhetoric that goes across national boundaries and demands that everyone within their reach behave in a certain way, and that's just a very different way of thinking about the world.
You jump ahead to page 158, and you mention somebody, we've talked about him a long time ago on this program, an Egyptian scholar by the name of Saeed Gupta. You write, who endorsed violent struggle to remove unholy leaders. Gupta's writings would influence Al-Qaeda and other modern groups. Gupta was trained somewhat or educated in Colorado.
Oh yeah, he spent a little time in the United States.
And then you jump to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Al-Qaeda, 9/11, who was educated in North Carolina.
Yeah.
And you've been over there looking at the world in the Middle East. Help us out on this. Are we creating this problem by letting people come in here and see how we live?
Oh, no, I don't think that that is the case at all. I mean, I think that when you look at specific instances, yes, there are people in history who've gone and had negative reactions to the United States and come back. And there is a kind of genealogy of radical thought, which scholars have uncovered and which I write about here but cannot claim any credit for uncovering. And it is kind of remarkable that you can go from this man in Pakistan and from some radical thinkers before him all the way forward to Osama bin Laden, gradually getting more and more radical as you go. Part of that has been contact with the West, but let's face it, radicals do not need to come to the United States to form negative opinions about the United States. They do just fine with their propaganda and with hardly any contact with the United States.
Where are they getting it over there? What did you find?
You have a lot of resentment of the U.S. Some of it is actually nationalist resentment, although it gets mixed up with Islam. In a place like Pakistan, people feel that they are colonized in a way, that they are dominated by the United States. There is a media which will play on those sentiments and whip them up. There is an army that is very influential in the country, extraordinarily influential in the country, and when it is to their benefit, when they see a benefit, they will whip up that anti-American sentiment. It's there also. It's not completely fraudulent, but it will be used to make political points. And if you're fighting a political battle in Pakistan and your rival, your opponent, is allied with the United States, attacking the United States is a way to attack them. So it's fraudulent in a way, although there are genuine concerns as well.
When you think back at Tunisia, and I'm going to move to Libya very quickly, but what's the one thing you remember most about Tunisia?
The one thing that I remember most about Tunisia is the openness of the place. I mean, it is a place where you can go to a bar called JFK and order a beer, but that openness in many ways is under threat. And, you know, alcohol is one thing, but it's become a symbol for people. There have been Islamists going around closing down liquor stores and attacking bars and that sort of thing. That's just one aspect of life, obviously. But it's kind of a stalking horse for many different ways that people are arguing over the role of Islam in the government, the rights of women in society, the ability to behave different ways. So it's a place where what we would think of as Western or universal values are dealing with very particular and religious concerns.
But back to Pakistan, you just wrote in the New York Times about a movie theater that was shot down or burned down.
Yeah.
And is at base there this whole philosophy from Muhammad and Islam?
Yeah, well, that was an incident that really troubled me, and I was grateful to the Times for publishing that, because I felt like I really had something to say about it. There's a movie theater that I write about in Instant City. I'd gone to visit it. It's been there since 1947, which is the founding year of the country. It had showed films from all over the world, from the United States, from England, from Bollywood and India. And to me, it symbolized the resilience of the country and the openness of the country in spite of all the violence and trouble that people have suffered over the last many decades in Pakistan. And during one of the protests against a video that insulted the Prophet Muhammad and had a very negative image of the Prophet Muhammad, during one of those protests, people turned against the movie theaters and burned them. I don't really see that as a protest against the West. I don't really see that as a protest against the United States, even though Avatar was one of the movies that you could have gone to see at this theater. you had Islamist activists who had not liked these movie theaters for decades, way before this Prophet Muhammad film, which was never shown in them anyway. And so they grabbed an opportunity to attack. And they whipped up a bunch of young people. There were teenagers involved who stole sodas from the snack bar on their way to burn this movie theater, to just torch it. And I argue in that piece that what they were really attacking was the nature of their own country, which perhaps they did not understand. And I try to say that with the greatest respect. Who am I as a foreigner to say what your country is about? But I do know from having studied the history, from having listened to Pakistanis themselves, that it's an incredibly diverse place. It was born as an even more diverse place than it is today. Lots of different cultures, lots of different traditions, lots of different ways to be. That movie theater symbolized Pakistan, and that is what people burned when they set it on fire. Okay, another kind of thing that you can explain the difference in you found in Libya, and it's got some. This has from your website, the NPR, some still pictures to show this. It's about golf. Oh yeah. It's about Libya. Before we show this, a couple words. What did you take away from Libya? What did I take away from Libya? I mean, the most, the thing that stays with you. Someday it really ought to be an awesome tourist attraction. Amazing Roman ruins, wonderful people, and it's beautiful. It's an energetic country, and it has so much potential because it has wealth. It's a very troubled country right now, but it could be an amazing place. Who took these pictures, by the way? This is John Poole, NPR photographer who traveled along with us. Okay, let's watch this. Okay. So we're driving through Libya, a country recovering from a civil war, and we stopped the car on a highway and stepped through an opening in a metal fence into a different world. Kids playing golf on a sandy wasteland. Wow. You got all of that one. Right up near the flag. Because there's no grass on this course, the players bring their own. Each player carries around a little square of artificial turf and places the ball on top of it for each shot. The bearded man is Taher Sadawi. He told us he is the coach of a junior national team, which includes his son, Hisham Sadawi. He's got a good stance, very relaxed, feet about shoulder width. Oh, that's beautiful. What do you want to do when you grow up?
A golf player.
No way, you want to be a pro golfer?
Hisham, please.
He's the second best player in Benghazi at the age of 12.
He's the brother of the first in Benghazi.
So your two sons are the two best players in Benghazi?
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite golfer among the golfers in the world?
Tiger Woods.
Tiger Woods? Okay. It's got about a 15-footer. Oh, right in the hole. Where did they get the interest in golf? I don't know where it came from, but it's a global sport. People play it everywhere. And we are talking here about a Mediterranean country. It's not so far from Europe where golf is big. And it is awesome, isn't it, to see how eager people are to play, that they're willing to go out and do it on a golf course that has virtually no grass. Where did you find them? I just ran across them. I had heard that there were such golf courses from the driver who was taking us all the way across Libya. I wanted to go see a course in Tripoli, didn't have time, but ended up going to find this one in Benghazi. I knew a guy who lived near there, and so he just took me right there. And you really do. You stop by the side of the highway and step through this fence, this opening in a fence, and there you are. And it's very rough. It's very raw. It's in the middle of the city, but it's kind of its own world. Go back to the discussion about Islam and Muslims and Muhammad, and you write about Sharia law. We've heard Sharia law mentioned in this country by politicians as something to worry about, that they will try to bring it here. Mm-hmm. Put Muhammad in perspective for somebody that's never really read about him. Okay, well, let me not speak as a religious scholar or as an expert. but essentially that is religious law. I mean, that is what Muslims are told that they need to follow. But I think it's important to realize that just as there are many different interpretations of Christianity, there are many different interpretations of Islam. What does that mean for different people? What does that mean for non-Muslims? And in the end, as I have learned it from listening to Muslims, Islam is a fairly simple religion. There's a relatively limited number of basic commands that allow you, if you follow them, to call yourself a Muslim. And it's a rather straightforward religion in that way. It can become profoundly, intricately complicated, and there can be endless numbers of rules. But I've been impressed by the efforts of scholars who know this far better than I to attempt to disentangle what Islam is from various cultural traditions and tribal traditions that have grown and built up in different ways. There are people in different parts of the world who have extraordinarily detailed and complex rules that they are convinced that they must follow and that other people should follow. I mean, the Taliban in Afghanistan was all about beards of precisely a certain length. I'm not sure that the Quran actually says that. You know, I'm not an expert. Maybe I've missed that part. But there are many debates within Islam as to its meaning. There are many debates within Islam that are really not Islam against the West. They are Muslim against Muslim. I think of a great scholar like Vali Nasser, whose writings have been very informative to me, and who is in Washington, D.C., who will talk about the way that Sunnis and Shias, two of the great sects of Islam, have sometimes collaborated and worked together, sometimes for political reasons been pushed apart in what seem to be fundamental ways. And you just have an incredible constellation of beliefs. And I think it was very well understood during the administration of President George W. Bush, and remains well understood by this administration, the Obama administration, today, that it is a challenge of the United States to make sure that we don't get played, that we don't get positioned so that we think the enemy is a billion people in the world who have this religion. It's a small minority of people with whom there is a problem. And then there are larger numbers of people who have deep concerns about the United States with whom the U.S. needs to figure out the proper way to engage. It is a religion that many people have practiced in many different ways. And in that way, at least, it is like almost any other religion you could name.
Why do, this is a question you get in trouble, but why do they believe in Muhammad? Where does that come from?
Why do Christians believe in Jesus?
Well, it's the same question, but I wondered what you saw, what you up close.
Why do they believe? I mean, wow, that is a tough question. I mean, there are people who fall away from that belief. I'm remembering a man that I spoke with in Pakistan once. We were on a noisy street and walking together and kind of away from other people, and he said, you know, I'm an atheist. I can't tell people that here. And so there is a great cultural pressure, I think, in overwhelmingly Muslim societies to have a certain kind of beliefs, a certain set of beliefs. But people come to that faith in many different ways. Some people grow up in it, some people study it, some people know the history in intricate ways, some people become very absorbed in the very specific rules they feel they have to follow.
If you walked up to somebody in your hometown of Carmel, Indiana, and get a couple and say, from now on you're going to be a Muslim,
I'm not going to do that.
I know. But if you did, how would their life change? Let's say they were Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, but how would their life change? What kind of, throw in Sharia law and all that, but give me some examples of how.
Well, let me mention a slightly different example, although it's not far away. I have a colleague at NPR who's from my home state of Indiana, who is of Pakistani origin. Her parents are Pakistani, and she's Muslim. And dresses differently, covers herself up in a different way. And So that is a very large part of her life. I mean, being in the United States, she's a woman, she can dress just about any way that she wants. And there are Muslim women who dress just about any way that you could imagine in many different parts of the world, including the United States. She makes a choice to dress a particular way, feels that that is religiously important to her, but at the same time is showing up for work, is married, has a home, is participating in society, is extraordinarily smart, is extraordinarily well educated, and so she has found an American way to integrate this religion that is foreign and strange to many people, integrate this religion into an American life. And perhaps you would say that her vision of Islam is compatible with that vision we discussed when we were talking about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a Muslim who nevertheless believes in a state that guarantees religious freedom rather than imposing religious restrictions.
How much religious freedom is there in Karachi today?
Less than there used to be. There is still religious diversity. This is a city that at the time of Pakistan's independence was majority Hindu. You'll recall that India and Pakistan were split into two separate countries. One was supposed to be mostly Muslim, the other supposed to be mostly Hindu, mostly. But there were millions of Hindus inside Pakistan. Karachi was a majority Hindu city. Within a few months, most of them fled, but some remain. And it's such a huge city. It's at least 13 million people. I don't actually know how many Hindus are there. I doubt that anybody could accurately count them, but it could be hundreds of thousands. It could be a million. There's diversity there. People practice different religions, even though if you are not a particular kind of Muslim, you can be harassed or worse.
What about today in Tunisia? Religious freedom?
There is religious freedom, and there is an openness still to the United States. People apologized when there were recent protests against the U.S. consulate and other targets. There is a variety of beliefs, but I would emphasize also that one of the biggest challenges to religious freedom in Muslim countries right now is faced by Muslims. People who are a minority sect, they're Shiites in Pakistan, for example, or they're Sufis with a variety of beliefs, or they're Ahmadis who are actually banned from calling themselves Muslims in Pakistan. One of the gravest threats to religious freedom and to religious tolerance in the Muslim world is faced by Muslims who are, in one way or another, intimidated or terrorized by people who want to impose their own version of the religion on them.
Here's another report of yours from, this was in Libya, and from your trip back the middle of this year.
The other day in Benghazi, Libya, we found our vehicle surrounded by truckloads of men with machine guns. They were waving black flags, which are associated here with conservative Islam, and they were shouting, Allahu Akbar, God is great. We were driving to see a protest at the time, but it seemed the protest had found us. These gunmen were the protesters, so we continued on, surrounded by scores of pickup trucks with anti-aircraft guns welded to the beds. The rebel fighters from Libya's revolution had brought their weapons along while demanding that their country impose Sharia, Islamic law.
Allah Akbar. Pronounce it the right way.
I'll probably get it wrong, but Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar. It sounds like Allah Akbar when they, when they say it. Right?
God is great.
Yeah. Do they say that because they believe it, or do they say that because it's a slogan?
Oh, I'm sure that people believe it. And I'm sure that the guys who brought all the guns to that demonstration sincerely believed that they were calling for the right thing. They wanted an Islamist government. They wanted an integration between their version of the faith and the state. And they brought truck guns, anti-aircraft guns mounted on the backs of trucks to this protest, which has informed my thoughts about news events more recently in Benghazi. When you talk about political protest in a place where there are all kinds of militias that have not been disarmed, that are more or less independent from the state, you have things that can happen very quickly and very violently in some kind of political demonstration, even if it supposedly starts peacefully.
The religious part of all this in Libya, we talked about Tunisia, talked about Pakistan. What about Libya? Is it open?
That's a very conservative society. I think if you were going to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, I don't know exactly what it would be, but it might be 6, 7, 8. I mean, it's
more
not,
than the others?
Yeah, definitely more conservative than either Egypt or Tunisia in terms of what you can get away with. Women can go around in Libya with their hair uncovered, but you'd have to be careful about exactly where and when you
Did Gaddafi
did that.
use that? Was that how, did he use that religion to keep...
Gaddafi went back and forth with religion. They were more kind of leftist, and I don't want to say secular exactly, but modernist in the early years of the Gaddafi regime, and he made a point of having women around him and female bodyguards and that sort of thing. But it was a basically conservative society, based in many ways on tribes. And that continues to be the case today. But this is a really, really interesting example because it's a really conservative place with Islamist groups, with a lot of militias, and yet they're people who have elected what may turn out to be a rather interesting government, who seem to be eager to have a relatively open society, and who, in a limited way at least, have made room for different kinds of people right now. So I think the jury's out as to where Libya is going to go.
How did you do all this? How did you write a book about Karachi? How did you make a 3-week trip over there and all that, and continue to be the anchor? Where do you find the time?
I had a very forgiving wife. That's the first thing.
You dedicate the book to her.
Well, I mean, my wife, Carolee, has taken great care of me and taken great care of our family, and is the author of some reference books on genealogy. And I'm very proud of her. But she has been very tolerant, to be honest with you. And I have great colleagues. There is a group of people at Morning Edition and more broadly at NPR that have believed in things that I've wanted to do, have worked like crazy to make them happen. I mean, I think about this trip across North Africa. In some of the desert areas of Libya, you just want to get across them as quickly as possible. And I don't know exactly how fast the driver was going, but we're sitting in the back of this van and we're maybe going 100 miles an hour. Like you're sitting there writing. I'm sitting there writing while we're driving. I'm writing the story that we want to have on the air in a few days. And Nishant Dahiya, the producer, is sitting next to me and he's listening to tape we've gathered. And John Poole, the photographer, is there. And we're working, and you just realize after a while, wow, we might be going 100 miles an hour here. We are flying across the desert, and then a tire gets blown out and we suddenly have to stop the van and get it fixed and go on again. And you just realize you're in this environment where anything can happen. Metaphorically speaking, there's no seatbelt, even if you're wearing a seatbelt. And there are people who come along with me to do that. And there are NPR colleagues who have taken far greater risks than I. Someone like Lourdes Garcia Navarro, who was in Libya during the early phase of Libya's revolution when it was extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily uncertain. So you rely on other people. You ask other people for help, and you also listen to other people's ideas. As a program host, I collaborate with a lot of people. I would like people to listen to me and to work and enact my ideas. But if I'm doing my job correctly, I should also be listening to the people around me and embracing their best ideas, even if they're a little scary to me. And once in a while that's happened.
A couple of years ago, NPR lived through some controversy surrounding Juan Williams. Mm-hmm. What residual is there?
Well, I think that in the end, it's made NPR stronger. There were a lot of attacks against the network. The network was criticized for the way in which it fired Juan. A lot of claims were made that were simply factually untrue. I can remember the claim that Juan was the only black man working at NPR. And then I would look around and there were 3 African-American program hosts out of 10. They were black women. There was an African-American man who's a correspondent over here. I mean, there was a variety of different kinds of people. It was an incredibly diverse place. Not as diverse as it could be, but better than a lot of media organizations. You had people from different countries, different national backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds. You had somebody who went to Harvard, and you had somebody like me from Morehead State University in Kentucky. You had somebody from upstate New York or from New York City, and you had somebody like me from Indiana. A lot of different kinds of people. And this caricature was drawn. That was annoying. But in the end, I think that it strengthened us, because you realize after a while that first, people are going to say what they say, and you still need to do your duty and do your job. I believe that we're doing something that's important for the country, to try to get reliable information to people. You need to continue doing that, and it doesn't matter what anybody says. And the second thing that you realize is that there's tremendous support for what's being done, even in a situation where, by the company's own admission, they horribly handled a very public situation. Even in that terrible circumstance, there continued to be tremendous support for what we were doing on the air. And we heard from the public, and have continued to hear from the public. It's a system all across the country that only exists because people in individual communities volunteer to pay for it, volunteer to support their local public radio stations. If people didn't do that, it'd be out of business tomorrow. And that support continued. And so you feel stronger in the end.
How concerned are you that a government, a faction of government, will come after NPR again?
You know, I mean,
what impact would it be on NPR if the federal money went away?
Well, that's two different questions. You know, I'm sure that there will be people who will be unhappy with individual stories that we do, unhappy more broadly with the way that NPR is funded and set up. There is a percentage, often a very small percentage, of federal money that goes to local stations, which in turn broadcast NPR programs. You know, I mean, I've got to push that aside, actually, and let people make their own decisions about that. I've got to focus on the job that I have to do. If people have concerns about a specific story, I always want to hear that. And I do hear that. And people will send me a tweet and say, you said some event happened in 1964. Actually, it was 1963. Thank you very much. We'll fix that. Or they'll say, I think you're missing a really important story here. What if you did something about that? And sometimes I can take those suggestions. And so when people have specific concerns that they can bring to the table, it's always great to hear. But when people make a broad complaint about bias and can't come up with a specific example of what the problem is, then there's really not much for me to do with that. And I respect their concern, I respect their opinion, but we need to have a discussion about things that are actually on the air. Quite frequently, when we go to the transcript of a story that bothers people, the transcript answers the concern. You discover that things are a little different in that transcript than they may have been perceived.
How long do you want to keep getting up at 2:45 in the morning?
Oh gosh, as long as they'll let me. I got a contract that lasts a couple years longer. It's probably not a job you can do forever, but it's an exciting job. I mean, you meet so many interesting people.
Anything else on your list when it comes to the media world that you want to do?
I am working on another book. I have a contract for another book. It'll be history. It involves Andrew Jackson and what was called Indian removal in the 1830s, the forcing of tens of thousands of Native Americans from the eastern United States in the time of President Andrew Jackson. And there's a particular story within that that I think deserves to be told.
How long have you wanted to tell that story?
Oh my gosh, I'm supposed to finish it within a couple of years. Hopefully I'll finish it in less.
No, my question was, how long have you wanted to tell that story?
Oh, how long have I wanted to tell that story? It's been on my mind for the last couple of years. I've been fascinated by the 1830s for a long time, very, very long, and I've just become more and more interested in it recently because we've had very difficult politics in our time. There were very difficult politics in the 1830s, and I feel that the politics of one era tells you something about our own.
You can go on our website and Q&A and look for the Steve Inskeep Show, and then there's a little thing there that says more information. They can click on that and go and find, and they will find your reports, the Revolutionary Road reports from the NPR website, plus your book, Instant City, which is about the life and death in Karachi. Steve Inskeep, host of Morning Edition, along with Renee Montagne on NPR. Thank you
It's been an honor.
very much for joining us.
Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.